A smirking judge thought this quiet black teen was just another lost cause, until one document shut the whole courtroom down. The fluorescent lights buzz softly in the county courthouse, casting a stark glow over the wood-panelled walls. The air is thick with quiet murmurs, papers rustling, and the occasional sharp rap of a gavel in the courtroom next door. It's a regular Wednesday afternoon, but for Malcolm Evans, this day is anything but ordinary. 17 years old, hands cuffed, wrists red from the tight metal biting into his skin. He sits at the defendant's table, back straight, his face a mask of quiet defiance and restraint. His mother, a few feet behind him, grips the armrests of her seat so tightly that her knuckles turn white. She hasn't said a word, but the tension in her body says enough. The charge? Resisting arrest. It started 3 nights ago in a neighborhood grocery store, a place he'd been to 100 times before. He had stepped inside for a bottle of water after a late-night study session at the library. He never made it past the entrance. An off-duty officer, moonlighting as security, had been watching him the second he stepped onto the sidewalk. Malcolm noticed the eyes on him, but he was used to it. The shift in posture, the subtle repositioning of a hand near a holster. It wasn't the first time. But what started as an uncomfortable stare-down turned into something worse. As Malcolm reached for his pocket, where his phone was buzzing, the officer's voice cut through the air. "Hands where I can see them!" The words hit like gunfire. A second later he was shoved against the glass door, his backpack yanked from his shoulders. The phone he had been reaching for clattered to the pavement, screen shattering on impact. "Stop resisting!" The words rang out before Malcolm could even process what was happening. Someone shouted. A woman gasped. By the time he hit the ground, a knee dug into his back, pressing him into the cold concrete. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't resisting. But that didn't matter. 2 more officers arrived, and within minutes he was in the back of a squad car. The store's security cameras, conveniently malfunctioning, the one witness who tried to speak up, told to leave before giving a statement. Now, sitting in this courtroom, Malcolm stares ahead at the polished bench where Judge Raymond Whitaker is reviewing the file in front of him. He flips through the pages with deliberate slowness, as if deciding how much of his attention this case even deserves. Malcolm doesn't say a word. He doesn't fidget. He doesn't plead. He knows this room was never designed for someone like him to win, but what he doesn't know yet is that today, something is about to shift. The judge looks up, and then the smirk. But Malcolm doesn't react, because he's seen this before. Judge Raymond Whitaker leans back in his chair, adjusting his glasses as he scans the file before him. The corner of his mouth lifts, not in amusement, but in something colder. Dismissal. The courtroom isn't silent, not entirely. A few whispered conversations drift from the back rows, attorneys shuffling papers, the faint hum of an air vent overhead. But in this moment, all of it fades against the judge's slow, deliberate sigh. 17 years old, he muses, tapping a finger against the folder. Resisting arrest, interfering with an officer. You've been busy. Malcolm doesn't flinch. He doesn't shift in his seat. Whitaker waits, as if expecting a response. When none comes, he lets out a low chuckle. Not much of a talker, huh? Well, that's probably for the best. He glances at Malcolm's public defender, a young woman named Teresa Carter, who looks like she's already restraining every ounce of frustration boiling beneath the surface. I'm guessing you'll be doing the talking for him. Carter squares her shoulders. Your Honor, my client was wrongfully detained. Whitaker holds up a hand, cutting her off. Wrongfully detained. He lets the words settle before shaking his head. Ms. Carter, I've been in this courthouse long enough to know a pattern when I see one. He gestures loosely toward Malcolm, as if he's nothing more than a case number instead of a human being. Tell me, Whitaker continues, do you think this young man was minding his own business, just strolling along and— Oh, what a surprise. An officer just threw him to the ground. A few chuckles ripple through the room. Not loud, but just enough to sting. Malcolm's mother shifts in her seat, her lips pressing into a tight line. Carter starts to speak again, but Whitaker raises a brow, already moving on. Now, let me guess, he drawls. Good student. Bright future. Maybe even, what's that phrase you lawyers love? Wrong place, wrong time. His words hang in the air, heavy with sarcasm. Malcolm clenches his jaw. fingers tightening into fists under the table. He's heard it before. The assumption. The belief that no matter what he says, what he does, the decision has already been made. Whitaker sighs again, flipping the file shut. I'll be honest. I don't have much patience for these cases. Waste of the court's time. Waste of taxpayer money. His gaze settles on Malcolm. Not with curiosity, not with concern, but with something closer to boredom. And that's when Carter moves. She doesn't raise her voice, doesn't slam her hand on the table. Instead, she reaches into her folder, pulls out a single sheet of paper, and slides it across the desk. Maybe you should read this before making any more assumptions, Your Honor. The judge hesitates. Then, with a dismissive flick of his wrist, he picks up the paper. His eyes skim the first few lines, then stop. Something shifts. A subtle twitch in his jaw. His shoulders straighten. The courtroom, once filled with quiet murmurs and scattered laughter, seems to still. Because what he's reading, it doesn't match the picture he painted in his head. Not even close. And just like that, the smirk disappears. The change in Judge Whitaker's expression is subtle, but it's there. The amused smirk, gone. The easy confidence, slipping. His eyes dart across the page again, as if trying to find a mistake. Some error that will let him go back to his original assumptions. But there isn't one. The document in his hand is Malcolm Evans' academic record. Straight A's. Advanced placement courses. Top of his class. And then there's the last line. Full ride scholarship to MIT. The silence in the courtroom is suffocating. A moment ago, this was just another case. Just another kid. But now, people are leaning in, straining to see what's on that paper. Whitaker clears his throat, stiffens in his chair. He wants to pretend this doesn't change anything, but the air in the room has shifted. Carter watches him, arms crossed. Something wrong, Your Honor. The judge looks up, expression unreadable. He forces out a small laugh, but it's weaker this time. MIT, huh? He exhales sharply, shaking his head. Didn't see that coming. He glances at Malcolm for the first time without condescension. Malcolm meets his gaze, unblinking. There's no smugness in his expression, no satisfaction, just a quiet, steady stare that says, "This is who I've always been." You just refuse to see it. The murmurs in the courtroom grow louder. The people who had chuckled at Whitaker's earlier remarks are no longer laughing. Whitaker taps the paper against the desk, regaining his composure. So, let me get this straight. He gestures vaguely toward Malcolm. This young man, who supposedly resisted arrest, is also some kind of genius. Carter doesn't hesitate. That's correct. A beat of silence. Then the judge lets out another short laugh. But this time, no one joins him. The weight of his mistake is settling in. The courtroom's mood has shifted. A few jurors shift uncomfortably. The officer who made the arrest, seated a few rows back, suddenly finds the floor interesting. Even the court reporter, normally unfazed by the drama that plays out in this room, has paused ever so slightly. Malcolm's mother exhales, hands trembling as she grips the fabric of her skirt. Whitaker taps his fingers against the desk, glancing at Malcolm again. This time his stare isn't dismissive, it's calculating. He's trying to figure out how to backpedal without looking like a fool. But there's no way out of this cleanly, and everyone in the room knows it. The judge leans forward, folding his hands, but now, Malcolm is watching him, waiting. Judge Whitaker clears his throat, forcing a tight-lipped smile as if this revelation is nothing more than an interesting footnote, rather than a complete dismantling of his assumption. He straightens in his chair, carefully setting the paper down, fingers tapping idly against the desk. Well, he starts, his voice a touch softer now. That certainly complicates things. Carter raises a brow. Complicates. The judge waves a hand as if brushing off the weight of the moment. I mean, I just find it a little odd. His eyes flick back to Malcolm, and for the first time there's something resembling uncertainty in them. A kid like you, with this kind of academic record, a future this bright, why would an officer feel the need to detain you? He says it so smoothly, as if he's guiding the room to a more convenient narrative. A misunderstanding, perhaps. A miscommunication. Certainly there must be some reason Malcolm ended up here. The attempt is transparent. Carter doesn't take the bait. That's exactly what I'd like to know, Your Honor. Whitaker's jaw tightens. He shifts in his seat, suddenly aware of how many eyes are on him. The power dynamic he controlled so effortlessly at the start of this hearing has flipped. Now he's the one under scrutiny. The courtroom, once casual and entertained, now feels different. He can feel the weight of it. Even the court clerk, normally unfazed by these cases, is watching him closely. Malcolm hasn't spoken yet. He doesn't need to. The silence is working in his favor. The judge exhales through his nose, reaching for the case file again. Stalling. But he's not reading. Not really. He's searching for something, anything, that will allow him to reclaim the authority he let slip through his fingers. Finally, he looks back up. "Mr. Evans," he says, his voice measured. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" It's an invitation. A chance for Malcolm to shrink, to soften the moment, to make things easier for the judge. But Malcolm doesn't take it. He leans forward slightly, the first real movement he's made since this hearing began. His voice, when he finally speaks, is calm, steady. "I do." The courtroom holds its breath, because now it's Malcolm's turn to speak. For the first time since stepping into this courtroom, Malcolm Evans finally speaks. His voice isn't shaky. It isn't loud. But it carries. "I want to ask you something, Your Honor." Judge Whitaker folds his hands, his expression neutral, but his fingers tighten slightly. "Go ahead." Malcolm takes a slow breath. "If I wasn't holding this scholarship, if I wasn't top of my class, if I was just another kid from my neighborhood, would that make me guilty?" Silence. A few heads turn. Some people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. It's the kind of question that sticks. Whitaker lets out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "That's not how the law works, son." Malcolm tilts his head slightly. "No? Because from where I'm sitting, it sure looks like you had this figured out before I even opened my mouth." More shifting in the gallery. Even Carter looks at Malcolm with something new in her eyes. Not just respect, but realization. He's taking control of this moment. Malcolm leans forward, his tone unwavering. "You didn't ask what happened. You didn't ask for proof. You didn't ask if there were witnesses. The only thing you wanted to know was whether or not I fit the story you've already told yourself." The judge's lips press together, his face unreadable. "And when you found out I didn't," Malcolm continues, "you tried to change the conversation." Someone in the back lets out a low murmur. The tension in the room is thick, stretching across every corner of the courtroom. Whitaker shifts in his seat, jaw tight. "Watch yourself, son." Malcolm doesn't blink. "I have. My whole life." The words land like a stone hitting glass. Carter doesn't stop him. She knows she doesn't need to. This isn't just about Malcolm anymore. This is about every kid who never got the chance to prove they weren't the problem. "So tell me, Your Honor," Malcolm says, his voice even, unwavering. "If I didn't have these grades, if I wasn't going to MIT, would I still be sitting here? Or would I already be another statistic?" Whitaker doesn't answer. He can't. Because everyone in this room already knows. And that's the moment the courtroom shifts. Because now, the judge is the one under judgment. The weight of Malcolm's words hangs in the air, thick and unmoving. The courtroom, once filled with quiet chuckles and dismissive glances, now feels different. People who had barely paid attention before are sitting up, eyes locked on the boy who was supposed to be just another case in an endless docket. The judge doesn't speak right away. His fingers drum lightly against the desk, his face unreadable, but the tension in his posture betrays him. He's thinking, calculating. But the courtroom isn't waiting. A woman in the back, someone who had come in for another case entirely, exhales sharply and mutters, "Damn." Even the arresting officer, who had been leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, shifts forward slightly. His jaw tightens. He doesn't like this attention. Malcolm's mother wipes at her cheek, trying to be discreet. But the relief is there. Not because this is over, but because, for once, someone had to listen. Carter, his attorney, doesn't say a word. She doesn't need to. Malcolm just did the one thing she had been trying to do since she took this case, make them see him. Judge Whitaker exhales slowly, looking down at Malcolm's file again. This isn't how these hearings usually go. he mutters, almost to himself. Carter tilts her head. Maybe they should. That earns a few nods from the jury box. Even the court clerk stops typing for a moment, glancing up at the judge. Whitaker finally lifts his gaze, looking at Malcolm with something new in his expression. Not quite regret, not quite apology, but something close to uncertainty, because he knows what just happened. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. This was a reckoning. And in this moment, for the first time in his courtroom, he's not the one in control. But the damage is already done. Judge Whitaker exhales, his fingers curling around the edges of Malcolm's file, as if he can somehow squeeze control back into his grasp. He looks at the paper, at the courtroom, at Malcolm, this quiet, composed teenager who just turned the weight of his own prejudice against him. For the first time, Whitaker doesn't know what to say. The courtroom remains still, waiting. But there's no undoing what just happened. The people in this room won't forget. Neither will Whitaker. He clears his throat. The court finds insufficient evidence to proceed with these charges. A pause. Then the gavel slams. Case dismissed. The words land with finality, but the moment isn't just about the legal decision. It's about what everyone just witnessed. Malcolm doesn't celebrate. He doesn't grin or gloat. He simply stands, unshackled, rolling his wrists to work out the stiffness where the cuffs had dug into his skin. He turns to his mother, her eyes shining, her lips trembling, and she grips his hands as if trying to absorb the weight he's been carrying. They don't need words. As they step toward the exit, the tension in the room shifts once more. Some people lower their eyes, uncomfortable with what they've just witnessed. Others meet Malcolm's gaze, nodding slightly, not in pity, but in understanding. Judge Whitaker watches them go, his jaw tight. He knows his reputation will survive this. He will go home, have dinner, show up again tomorrow, just as he always has. But the next time a young black teen sits in front of him, something will be different. Because now, he will think twice. And maybe, just maybe, that's how change begins. This wasn't just about Malcolm. It was about how quickly society decides who someone is before they ever open their mouth. How many young men like him never get the chance to prove themselves. How many never get to walk free, not because they did anything wrong, but because someone in power decided their fate before the first word was spoken. The truth is, Malcolm shouldn't have needed perfect grades or an MIT scholarship to be seen as innocent. He should have been given the same benefit of the doubt as any other kid. But the world doesn't work that way. And until it does, people like Malcolm will keep fighting to be heard. If this story made you think, even for a second, then share it. Speak on it. Because the only way things change is if we refuse to let them stay the same.